Variation. I want to talk about variation. So, variation or exercise novelty, exercise modifications, and complexes. Kind of how I use variation and kind of how my philosophy towards variation and towards these different things sort of manifests itself. So, productive use of variation not only prevents adaptive resistance from occurring, but can also improve athlete adherence and engagement with the program. That's something I believe very much that the use of variations, the use of these different exercises and this novelty effect is something that really needs to be looked at from a qualitative standpoint, not just the quantitative impact it has. So there's really like three primary forms of exercise variation from this standpoint. And we're talking only about exercises, not necessarily variation through different reps and sets or variations in load. So exercise sequencing, that would be the planned change of one exercise to similar but different exercises. So, usually both exercises share portions of the same technical structure or overlap certain phases of the technique. For example, like a clean from the hang above the knee would turn into a clean from the hang below the knee. Both exercises are emphasizing similar portions, bordering phases of the lift. From above the knee, you're emphasizing the explosion and the final acceleration of the clean. Below the knee, you're emphasizing, the explosion and the final acceleration, but also the transition because you're now below the knee. So we're moving from developing phase number 4 to also developing phase number 3. It's important to remember that when you're sequencing exercises and you're changing them, that you are not so dramatically different, and you're keeping the phases similar to each other, close to each other. We don't want to work on, one portion or one exercise where we stop at the instant of separation, the first phase, right off the floor, and then also work at the overhead squat. You're just so different in those things. It's just a complete change. There's really not going to have the same effect you want. You're going to start to lose that directed adaptation. So, second would be a modification to the exercise's execution, changing the conditions which exercise is performed, snatch with no hook, no feet, adding an eccentric component or an isometric component, changing the tempo of execution, starting with the movement slowly, then accelerating, doing a snatch from the hang where you're lowering the bar slowly, doing a snatch with an isometric pause at some point, those kind of things. These changes, they're modifying the exercise, not necessarily in its mechanical structure in the way it's in the positions it's performed from, but in the execution of the lift itself. This variation is useful to keep relative intensity high without an excess of absolute intensity, right? So you're not going to accumulate a ton of fatigue this way. If you're close to a competition and you're trying to keep relative intensity high, if, let's say on a Monday you have a huge workout of snatches, the second day you also have more snatching planned, you can do that with no hook, no feet. It makes the exercise relatively more hard without increasing the average, without increasing the absolute intensity of the workout. So you're not generating more and more fatigue, but you're still challenging the lifter to perform at a high level. And then the third would be the complexification of exercises. This is the idea of combining multiple exercises that influence different phases of the technique, like a clean plus a front squat plus a jerk, or a snatch pull plus a snatch. That would be a complex where you're incorporating multiple exercises that are different into one set or one exercise that's done sequentially. So this method is best suited as an overload to increase, it's best suited as an overload during an increase of volume to kind of stave off stagnation. If you're doing, triples in the clean for several workouts in a row, you're doing a lot of cleans. That's really productive and great. But towards the end of that loading, as you overload, you might get to the point where the athlete becomes very, stagnant, or it feels like a monotonous kind of training. So you could modify that by saying, if the first week we're doing 4 triples, the second week we do 5 triples, the third week we might switch the exercise. The intensity can stay the same and the volume can stay on the planned course, but instead of doing triples in the clean, you might do, 2 cleans plus a front squat plus a jerk, or a clean plus a hang clean plus a front squat plus a jerk, or something where the exercise modifies itself, or is modified. There's the same amount of volume, the same directed adaptations are there, and you're moving into something that has some kind of novelty to give the athlete a little bit more engagement, a little bit more excitement during that. It also becomes a more intense stimulus because it's a new exercise. And then finally, these things can all be used during periods of deloading. So modifying these exercises, or complexing them, or changing exercise during a period of lighter loading can magnify the impact of that exercise. Be careful to do too much of that, because you can just negate the effect of the deload by having everything become more stressful. But you can use much lighter loads and have the impact be a little bit more significant during a period of deloading, where that can be beneficial. I would say that the major problems here are going to be an excess application of variation, right? Leading to like an interference in directed adaptations, where you're doing so many variations, or you're so frequently changing exercises, or you're doing so many things that are too different from the classical lifts, that you interfere with any directed adaptation you're trying to get. So, making everything a complex, or always doing things without a hook grip and without moving your feet, or always with slow eccentrics, easily can turn into just a mess. You're not going to get the results you want. In addition to that, doing them at the wrong time, right before competition, throwing in a lot of variation, not a good idea. The right variations need to be planned so that when you do change them, the right situation has to be set, so that when you do change variations, the effect is what you're looking for. It's always going to be a situation of, we want the training program to be, that the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. That we add these pieces together and gain more than they would, or sorry, the other way around. That the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That all these pieces together is greater than any one of them individually. That the augmentation of results happens because we use variation, not that in spite of our variations, we were able to make progress. I would say practical recommendations to apply variation. Variation should occur strategically, just talked about, not broadly. We don't want to always apply variations simply because we can. We want to place them at the right time, to prepare ourselves, be prepared for them to happen, place them at the right time so that we gain something from their placement in the program, not just that they're there for the sake of having them there. Again, this kind of comes down to implementing modified exercises, no hook, no feet type stuff. When intensity decreases from previous sessions, in order to make that relative intensity higher, that would be a situation where we're talking about strategic implementation. Second would be make complexes out of logical exercise pairings and implement them as volume increases to manage monotony. So again, when we create complexes, they need to have a logical nature to them. We don't want to just make things that are, stupid, like you see in a lot of situations where people just invent complexes for the sake of doing one. Cleans and back squats is not a complex. A complex is something that augments, in one way it augments either the strength that you're trying to develop. So if you have a weak pull, you add pulls to your cleans because it augments the stress on that phase of the lift that you need more work on. Or you modify exercises you create complexes out of exercises to break up monotony by implementing something that is perhaps, an exercise you're good at. If you're better at hang cleans than you're at cleans, you might see an increase or a benefit of including a hang clean in a complex with a clean, because now you have something the lifter is confident in, something the lifter is capable in, that they can rely on the technique and the ability to do that lift better, then transfer that confidence and skill and success into the actual clean on the next rep. And then again, complexes should be done as the volume increases in the training. If you're moving into a week of lesser volume where you have lesser reps per set and complexing those exercises, or making them into complexes, you're kind of negating the effect, the point of it. You're just taking lighter work and doing more stuff with it for no reason. And then finally, exercise rotation should focus on technical practice and skill acquisition around the most technically weak phases of the lift, blending the volume of work through each phase. So what that really means is when we rotate exercises, there has to be a sequence, going from exercise 1 to 2 to 3 throughout the program, has to be a logical sequence that makes sense. If your weakest phase of the lift is phase number 3, the transition, moving the bar past your knees properly, then we would want to start by emphasizing the aspects around that. So from the ground to the knee, phase 1 and 2, from phase 4, 5, and 6, we want to emphasize things around that in addition to emphasizing the actual phase we're trying to work, which would be phase 3. The reason for this is that the problem is not necessarily always just the single phase that we have an issue in. It's going to be a complex of movement from one phase to the next, to the next, to the next. There's a chain reaction. So when we're sequencing the exercise, we want to draw on areas that we're strong in technical practice, phases 1, 2, phases 3, 4. We know we're better there, so we emphasize them in addition to exploiting the results we can get out of emphasizing phase number 3 by really hammering on that transition. So understand that movement between those things should be blended together in a way that we're hitting the thing directly we need, but we're also including things that are very, very similar, very, very close into that. And then this process can also take place through the use of complexes and also take place with modifications, right? If you have a problem with barbell trajectory and a problem with phase number 3 of the lift, then you should reflect that in the program by including exercises with no hook, no feet, in addition to exercises that address the transition, hang snatch below the knee. So understand that it's a blending of all these things. It's not just, oh, that's my problem, directly hit it with everything we can. And, avoid, the kind of key there is to avoid rotating exercises between phases that are really distant. Example, like I said in the very beginning, snatch with a pause right off the floor combined with like a snatch from the hip or an overhead squat. These are just completely, they're related, but they're very far from each other. You're not going to see great smooth transitions between technical skills and improvement in those things if you're doing things that are dramatically different all the time. Much like with any variation, if you're just bouncing around from this to that to this to that, you won't see great skill acquisition in that stuff. All right, thanks.